The IRS never gets tired of getting its ass kicked, and I'm just the guy to do it. I've been dealing with IRS policy and administration for over 45 years. Let's take some questions from the proletariat and see what's going on out here. When people get a raise, they lose. Number one thing people worry about is hitting the next tax bracket. Sad that success is punished. And that's exactly the problem with the income tax system. The more money you make, the higher rate of tax you pay. You don't just pay more taxes, you pay a higher rate. And that discourages savings, investment, and productivity. You need to understand one of the basic principles of economic policy, and that is what you tax, you get less of. What you subsidize, you get more of. When we tax production, savings, and income, that's what you get less of. And ironically, those are the things that we need to drive the engine of economic growth. We need a system that doesn't burden those items, and a consumption tax is it. We don't want a regressive system. We don't want a progressive system. Tell me, what's this magical system then? Because those are the only two options. And that's not true. And you just put your finger on the number one problem that we have with the understanding of the American people of tax policy. We don't have just two systems, progressive and regressive. First of all, let's understand what we're talking about. A progressive system hits higher income people harder, and a regressive system falls on lower income people harder. All right. And we don't want either one of them. I agree with this viewer that we don't want a progressive system. We don't want to punish people for making more money. We don't want a regressive system. We don't want to punish people who are on the lower end of the economic system just because they're on that lower end of the strata. But there is a third option, and the third option is never, and I mean never, talked about. But the third system is a proportional system. A proportional system falls on all income levels in proportion to their income. Higher income people naturally spend more money under a proportional system. Higher income people naturally pay more taxes under a proportional consumption tax system because they spend more money. Lower income people naturally pay less tax under a proportional system because they spend less money. The proportional system falls on all income categories in proportion to either their riches or their parsimony, depending on where they fall on the economic scale. The more you make, the more you pay. The less you make, the less you pay. The proportional system is the solution. Taxes are a sham anyway. They're never going to be able to reduce the debt. We are taxed on anything and everything for the rest of our lives. There should be no income tax at all. Well, I agree that there should be no income tax at all. As I said, what you tax, you get less of. What you subsidize, you get more of. When we tax income, savings, and productivity, you get less income, savings, and productivity. We don't want that. It is also very true that unless they get their arms around the debt, we are never going to solve the financial problems that the United States have. We've got what, 34, 35, 36 trillion dollars worth of national debt right now. We've reached a point in the United States where $1 trillion represents the annual funding for the interest on the national debt. We are paying $1 trillion on the interest on the national debt on an annual basis. Unless the people who have created this problem over the last 60 or 70 years are fundamentally irresponsible, and it is unconscionable what these people have done to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren for generations to come because of this massive debt that they have saddled us with. We've got to get rid of the debt, and the only way to get rid of the debt is to get rid of the spending. And when I say cut spending, I'm not talking about cutting spending by 2% or 5%. I'm not talking about 20% or 30%. I'm talking about cutting federal spending in half as a starting point, and then go from there to really get serious about cutting it down. There is no other way to solve this problem. And year after year after year, we see, well, not quite year after year, but every 2 to 4 years, we have this national debate in the United States on the debt ceiling. Every couple of years, Congress reaches the limit of spending set on its credit card. And rather than stopping spending, they just give themselves another credit card by increasing the debt ceiling. Friends, this has got to stop. We are not going to get this problem under control until they stop spending money like wild people who are completely irresponsible and out of control. Nothing like shifting the tax burden to the poor. Well, that's your ignorance speaking right there. Consumption tax does not shift the tax burden to the poor. It spreads the tax burden out across all levels of income earning. Higher income people pay more taxes because they spend more money. Lower income people pay less taxes because they spend less money. Fact of the matter is, everybody's got to have skin in the game when it comes to the cost of funding government. The more we have a growing segment of the population that can vote themselves benefits from the Treasury without ever having to pay for them, the less likely we are to get this spending problem out of control. People under control. All people have to have skin in the game to keep the cost of government down. Walz took Minnesota from an $18 billion surplus to a $6 billion deficit. He's an incompetent governor who has proven that he has no respect for the Minnesota taxpayer. Keep voting blue. Well, my advice is stop voting for Democrats, but you're exactly right. Walz is completely irresponsible, and it's not just that he spent the money, all right? It's bad enough spending the money, but they spent the money on creating additional programs that have to be funded year after year after year. So this is an ongoing funding commitment now that the Minnesota legislature has made on the backs of the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota. And it's true, these people have no respect. They have no respect for the time and energy and effort that it takes the average American, the average Minnesota worker to earn their income. We've got a situation in the United States right now where federal, state, and local taxes are claiming about 40 to 45% of all the income that people earn. All right. And what happens is when you have the level of fraud that's going on in the state of Minnesota, spending, again, that's one problem. But we've got hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud that's being uncovered in the state. And it seems like there's not a day that goes by that there's not more fraudulent programs that are uncovered to the tune of 50 million or 100 million. They're up to about 650, 700 million dollars in exposed fraud in our state right now. What this evidence is that the legislators in the state of Minnesota have no regard for the property rights of the people that earn that money. All right. These people are giving the workers in the state of Minnesota, I'm talking about the taxpayers in the state of Minnesota, go out and they trade their finite resource, their time, in exchange for wages and salaries, and the state comes in and takes combined, all federal, state, and local governments are taking half of that money and they're squandering a giant share of it. Friends, these are people that have no regard for the lifeblood of the effort that goes from the taxpayer into the economy to produce that income. They're stealing your money. What it amounts to is they're stealing your money. They have taken control, labor, and the fruits of your labor, and they have turned you into a serf. My wife and I are in the upper 1% here in Minnesota. We are currently planning our exit, taking our company, selling all of our properties, and heading to Florida. Off the rails under Walz. It is off the rails, and what this listener is indicating now is what's happening on a very large scale in the state of Minnesota. We are having a significant excess of high-income earners in this state. The leftist Democrats hate high-income earners, but let's not forget that it's the high-income earners that pay the bulk, the overwhelming amount of the taxes that are paid at the federal and state levels. All right, the top 1% of income earners pay about 40% of all the income taxes paid. It's a significant amount of revenue that high income earners are responsible for paying into the states, and the leftist Democrats hate them and they're driving them away. There was a study that was done by a Minnesota Public Policy Research Institute, the Center of the American Experiment, that was released last summer that indicated that the state of Minnesota is bleeding high-income earners. They're leaving for South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, like this viewer is leaving for Florida. These are low-tax states. These states that I just named all have no income taxes. It is much easier to prosper in these states than it is in the leftist states like New York and Minnesota and California and so on. All right, so your Marxist policies are driving the high-income earners out of the state of Minnesota. It needs to stop. Sounds bogus. Who's moving? Sounds like Republican lies. Well, there's your ignorance speaking. All you have to do is go to the website of the Center of the American Experiment and look at the research numbers that they produce based on state of Minnesota, Department of Commerce and Revenue Department data that show that high income earners are fleeing the state. All right, people can vote at the ballot box and they can vote with their feet. And what's happening in the state of Minnesota, because the Marxists have taken over our state, is the high income earners in Minnesota are voting with their feet. We are the only first world power that doesn't just tell you what taxes you owe. The IRS knows for the most part how much everyone makes on a W-2. If you disagree, you can file a separate tax return. Well, okay, fine. If your only source of income is wage income that's reported on a W-2, then the IRS can mostly know that, except for the fact that we got deductions, credits, exemptions, and all of these various things that factor in that take away the element of just simply taking your income and applying a multiplier like 15 15 or 20% and saying, okay, that's the tax you owe. That is owing to the fact that we've got the most complicated tax system in the world. We got a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words that were changed more than 6,000 times just since 2001 alone. It's not just a matter of taking a W-2. And what do you do with the people that have W-2 income plus self-employment income? The self-employment income generally is not reported to the IRS. And even if it is reported on a 1099, which a lot of it certainly is, you got business expenses that the IRS has no way to calculate. You have the right to claim deductions against your business income for expenses that were incurred in the process of earning the income. All right. That's just a matter of constitutional law that you're not taxed on gross receipts. You're taxed on net profit or what is defined as income. That is to say the fruits of the labor removed from the capital costs involved of producing it in total. This can only be done with a tax return that's filed by the citizen. The way you abolish the tax return is you abolish the income tax system. The way you figure out how much a person knows so that they can wake up in the morning and know what their tax liability is going to be instead of having to make and keep records and hire tax professionals to figure it out for them is to have a uniform consumption tax on all goods and services. That's the only way to do it.